Uh, Last but not least, Michael Dickson, Executive Director, Stand With Us Israel. Mr. Dickson is the Executive Director of Stand With Us, the global Israel education nonprofit organization, and an expert on Israel and public diplomacy. Michael.
Thank you very much, Attila. It's great to be with so many friends, allies, and quite frankly, heroes in the room today doing incredible work. I appreciate all the organizers and everything that's gone into this. I'm here today to talk about, obviously, the serious issue. And as we've discussed, in a nutshell, support for Israel in the United States is changing, and we can no longer assume that future support. And I'm going to share with you some examples, particularly from young people. One of the blessings of my job is that I get to work with an incredible amount of young people. I used to be one myself. And I'm going to give you some examples that will really show where the rubber hits the road, you know, where the headwinds are going. And so, as Attila mentioned, Stand With Us is extremely engaged in the fight against anti-Semitism. We have offices on 6 continents. We have a huge presence on social media. We have a legal department working with Elisa and many of our wonderful partners to help fight anti-Semitism and classic anti-Zionism. We partner with many great organizations, including many of the people in this room. The lion's share of our resources and staff are located in the United States. We have over 100 employees in the US and engage campus, high school, middle school, and community audiences all across the countries every day. So we know the trends, and we're deeply concerned. We've understood the threat of BDS as a form of anti-Jewish bigotry since 2010, and now, in addition to the BDS campaigns, we're confronting rising anti-Semitism across the board. I want to give you one real-life example to begin with, and it's a recent one, of a 13-year-old student, high school student, who contacted our team in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago. She contacted us because the principal didn't like the name of her student group, and the name of her student group was Juice for Jews. It was a place for Jewish students to get together, eat food, and socialize and have fun activities. But shockingly, the assistant principal told the student that the word Jew could be construed as offensive. So she had to take that off because the word Jew had negative connotations. We also have growing numbers of people who are deeply concerned. And we're seeing this happen in middle school, and it's getting worse in many high schools and universities. There are anti-Israel forces working in overt ways and, as we've discussed, behind the scenes to separate people, Jews particularly, from Israel, which of course is part of their identity. And we're seeing it happen all across the board. Now, we can no longer assume that that support for Israel will remain strong in future. And what is frightening is that in some cases there are limited opportunities to push back against these threats. And I'll give you an example. Hussein Abu Bakr is one of our Stand With Us educators. He grew up in Egypt. He was surrounded by systemic anti-Semitism in schools, in the media, all around him. He was indoctrinated against Jews at a very young age. Remarkably, he overcame it and was able to see and free his mind from that. So he knows anti-Semitism when he sees it. Recently, he went to a prestigious graduate school in Washington, D.C. to study the Middle East. He writes about this experience in his Times of Israel blog, and I encourage you all to read it. His article describes the danger that we face in elite institutes of higher education. In a nutshell, his graduate school course, there was an assumption that Israel is bad, that Israel was born in sin as a colonizing country and is now an apartheid regime against the Palestinian people. And disturbingly, but not surprisingly, there is very little room for debate. Edward Said's theories are assumed to be the undisputed truth. Israel is bad, that's a given. And the students don't know enough to question these assumptions. Hussein talks about speaking to a fellow student who he had a conversation with about Edward Said and gave a different view. And that student turned around to him and said, "Wow, I never heard anyone disagree with Edward Said." So ask yourself this. What is the likelihood that students who have limited knowledge will remain open-minded about Israel after they finish one course after another where the consensus is so deeply anti-Israel? When they become leaders and policy makers and corporate executives, what's the likelihood that they're going to make supporting Israel a priority? And the problems we're seeing in Congress and on a corporate level with firms like Morningstar could get much, much worse. So let's talk about why this problem will be so difficult to solve. professors have academic freedom, as we know. They don't have to teach about Israel or the conflict in a balanced way. They can weave anti-Israel content into many courses which don't even focus on the region. Far too many professors are anti-Israel, and the consensus in graduate schools means that this will likely get worse, not better. And it's not like there's nothing we can do against institutional bias against universities. Recently, at the University of Washington, a donor by the name of Becky Ben-Arroyo endowed their new Israel Studies chair in the hopes that the new department would teach Israel studies in a balanced and accurate way. The donor meant well, but later she grew concerned about the direction of the program. The Israel Studies chair in 21, the professor of the very department that Becky funded, signed an anti-Israel letter following the war with Israel in that year. And in an unprecedented act, the university offered the Ben-Arroyo family back their $5 million, and the Ben-Arroyo family took it. So there can be some ways that we hold universities accountable, but here is the problem. University of Washington spokesperson Victor Bolter said, and I quote, "Our mission as a university demands that our scholars have the freedom to pursue scholarship where it leads them." After several months of good conversations with the faculty member, the University of Washington leadership, and the donor, Mrs. Ben-Arroyo requested that her gift be returned, and we agreed that this was the best path forward. So let me repeat the problem, stated by Victor Bolter in this quote. "Our mission as a university demands that our scholars have the freedom to pursue their scholarship where it leads them." So the campus returned the money, but the underlying problem has not changed. The lack of intellectual diversity among faculty when it comes to Israel remains the same in these elite institutions. The vast majority of the time, the scholarship will lead them to repeat and add to the anti-Israel narrative and consensus. And their right to academic freedom will leave us with limited recourse, and American students are being indoctrinated with only one anti-Israel point of view. And as Shoham mentioned, this doesn't begin or end with universities. Since Palestinian groups and their supporters have succeeded in making their cause a black and white social justice issue, there are many overt and covert ways that Israel and the Jewish people are being attacked. We heard about the challenge of ethnic studies at this conference. Anti-Israel groups have created a national coalition dedicated to promoting this so-called liberated ethnic studies. And their goal is to use public schools across America as a platform for their bias and hate. The goal is to indoctrinate tens of millions of students to see Israel as evil, starting in middle school and high school. And more likely, how many of these students will become voters who are more than happy to support politicians who include anti-Israel agendas in their platform? It's unlikely. So are public school teachers and administrators willing or able to prevent this from happening? Some might be. But many are getting their education degrees at the same universities that systematically promote anti-Israel bias. We've already seen large teacher unions endorse BDS or take other anti-Israel positions. So I cannot emphasize this enough. The problem has spilled out of the university. There's a real danger that US education systems at every level will become a threat to the US-Israel relationship. And this is not by accident, as we've heard. It's part of a sinister long-term threat to control the narrative, turning the public against Israel and Jews against ourselves. So now what are our young people in America and other places? Far too many of them are unprepared to deal with being bombarded by poisonous and anti-Israel rhetoric in school and on social media. If they lack inspiration, information, and pride, they may experience not only isolation, but fear and shame. Many of these young people are joining social justice groups, which have already been turned against Israel by our anti-Israel opposition. Too often, they're told that they can't be part of an intersectional social justice movement unless they condemn Israel and become anti-Zionist. Jewish students who aren't educated or have a weak Jewish identity may not be able to withstand the pressure. So what will the impact be on students who experience isolation, fear, and shame against Israel? Will they give into this cancel culture and adopt negative views by their peers? Or will they come home to their parents and say to them, "Why didn't you tell me this about Israel?" Many have already done that. They could join anti-Israel groups because they'll assume that Israel is a colonial occupier committing apartheid and genocide. And what will this do for future support for Israel? The first thing we must do is inspire Jewish students to build a strong Jewish identity and connection to Israel. We have to educate them to know about Israel's history and important connection to the Jewish people. They need to know how to remain unapologetic and proud Zionists, even when they disagree with an Israeli government or particular policy. And they need to understand that Israel, the only Jewish country in the world, is under unfair attack from a variety of angles, including inside the classroom. This is difficult enough, but this is only the beginning of what we need to do. Friends, our work is cut out for us. There's a force working all the time to turn young Jews and non-Jews against Israel. The impact for the future is dangerous, and we're seeing the future now. This really is a race against time. Thank you.